The world swam back into focus, a blur of asphalt and chrome. Jinxie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of panic. Her ancient, sputtering car had stalled, not once, but twice, on the way to this interview, the most important interview of her life. Her mother's surgery bill loomed over her, a monstrous debt swallowing every bit of hope. This job, at high-end group, was her last chance. And now, she was late. Terribly late. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward with a protesting groan. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, her voice tight with desperation. A figure darted out from between parked cars. Brakes screeched. The car shuddered to a halt, inches from the man. Jinxie gasped, her hands clenching the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. The man stood frozen, his face pale, a briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He wore a meticulously tailored suit, the kind that whispered of wealth and power. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. Even in the midst of near disaster, Jinxie noticed the almost unsettling precision of his appearance. "He looks like he's never had a bad hair day in his life," she thought, a flicker of resentment sparking within her. "What is this driving? You almost hit me and you didn't even apologize." His voice was low and controlled, laced with an icy disapproval that sent a shiver down her spine. Jinxie fumbled for the door handle, her mind racing. Apologize? Of course, apologize. But first, get to that interview. "I am so sorry," she stammered, scrambling out of the car. "I'm incredibly late for an interview. I wasn't paying attention." The words tumbled out, a jumble of excuses and apologies. He stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Jinxie felt a strange unease, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. This man, this impeccably dressed stranger, radiated an aura of controlled power that both intimidated and intrigued her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him before, but the memory, if it was one, remained elusive, a phantom flickering at the edge of her consciousness. "Be more careful next time," he said finally, his voice still clipped. He turned and walked away, his steps measured and precise, disappearing into the sleek glass doors of the high-end group building. Jinxie watched him go, her heart still pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Focus, Jinxie. The interview. Your mother." She smoothed down her wrinkled skirt, straightened her jacket, and followed him inside, the cool air of the lobby a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the street. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly polished smile, directed her to a waiting area. The pristine white walls, the abstract art, the hushed whispers of other interviewees, everything screamed corporate power. Jinxie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the cheap fabric of her dress suddenly feeling inadequate, a stark contrast to the expensive suits and designer bags around her. She pulled out her phone, checking the time for the 10th time in as many minutes. She was still late. "You're so slow. If Mr. Gu gets angry, none of us can escape." A sharp whisper jolted her back to reality. It was one of the other interviewees, a young man with nervously slicked back hair. Jinxie offered a weak smile, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. "Mr. Gu. Could that be the man she almost ran over?" The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Suddenly, a door opened and a stern-faced woman called her name. Jinxie stood up, her legs feeling strangely wobbly. She followed the woman down a long corridor, the silence broken only by the clicking of her heels against the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her fragile hope. The woman led her into a spacious office, the walls lined with bookshelves and awards. Behind a large, imposing desk sat the man from the street. Jinxie's breath caught in her throat. It was him. Mr. Gu. The man she almost turned into roadkill. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of recognition in his dark eyes. Jinxie's mind raced. This is a disaster. A complete and utter disaster. He gestured towards a chair, his expression unreadable. Please, have a seat, Miss He. He glanced at a file on his desk. Jinxie. Jinxie sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing, analyzing. She tried to meet his eyes, to project an image of confidence, but her nerves were frayed, her carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of his scrutiny. This wasn't just any interview. This was a test. A test she was failing miserably. Unbeknownst to Jinxie, this interview was far from ordinary. Gu Si-cheng, CEO of Haiyan Group, was not looking for an employee. He was looking for a girlfriend. Or, more accurately, a pretend girlfriend to appease his overbearing grandmother, whose sole mission in life seemed to be seeing him married before she shuffled off this mortal coil. His grandmother's relentless pressure had driven him to this desperate, and frankly, absurd measure. He had repurposed his company's interview process, turning it into a bizarre, clandestine search for a suitable candidate to play the role of his devoted fiancée. The near accident with Jinxie had thrown him off balance. Her frantic energy, her barely contained desperation, was a stark contrast to the polished, rehearsed presentations of the other candidates. There was a raw authenticity about her that intrigued him, a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched her fidget in her chair, her eyes darting around the room, her anxiety palpable. She's clearly not suited for this, he thought, a flicker of annoyance mixed with an unexpected surge of pity. He opened the file in front of him, his gaze scanning the neatly typed resume. Jinxie's qualifications were underwhelming, to say the least. An online broadcaster. With barely any followers. This was far from the polished, sophisticated image he had envisioned for his pretend girlfriend. He closed the file with a snap, his decision made. This charade was becoming more ridiculous by the second. He would end this interview quickly, send her on her way, and try to salvage the rest of this disastrous day. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the words that came out surprised even him. Tell me, Miss He, why are you so desperate for this job? The fluorescent lights of the Haiyan Group interview room hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the nervous fidgeting of the women waiting their turn. Jinxie smoothed down her skirt for the 10th time, the cheap fabric clinging uncomfortably in the late summer heat. She tugged at the collar of her borrowed blouse, the starched cotton a stark contrast to the anxieties churning within her. Just get through this, she told herself, her internal monologue a mantra against the gnawing fear. Get the job, get the money, get mom her surgery. The clicking of heels announced the exit of the previous candidate, her face a mask of strained politeness. Jinxie's heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, the panel of interviewers, faces impassive, barely glanced at her resume. The questions came rapid fire, a volley of industry jargon and demands for experience Jinxie barely possessed. She stumbled through her answers, the carefully crafted facade of confidence cracking with each syllable. Desperation clawed at her. This job, this chance, it was everything. Thank you for your time, Miss He, the lead interviewer said, his tone dismissive. Hope withered inside her. This was going nowhere. She rose, her legs feeling strangely heavy, a preemptive wave of defeat washing over her. Wait, a voice called out, stopping her mid-step. It was the younger man on the panel, the one who'd barely spoken. Gu Si-cheng. His eyes, a disconcerting shade of dark gray, held a strange intensity. "Miss he continued, his voice a smooth baritone that belied the unsettling gleam in his eyes. "Perhaps we could discuss another opportunity." Confusion warred with a flickering spark of renewed hope. Jinxie hesitated, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. "Another opportunity?" He gestured towards an adjoining room. "This way." His gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. The adjoining room was smaller, more intimate. The air felt thick with an unspoken tension. Gu Si-cheng closed the door behind them, the click echoing in the sudden quiet. He leaned against the desk, his posture casual, yet his eyes held a disconcerting focus. "Miss he began, his voice low and measured, "I'm not particularly interested in the broadcaster position." He paused, as if gauging her reaction. Jinxie's stomach lurched. This was not how she envisioned this day unfolding. What's going on? She wondered, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. However, he continued, his gaze unwavering, "I'm very interested in your potential." "Potential?" She repeated the word, her voice laced with bewildered caution. He pushed himself off the desk, his movements precise and economical. "My grandmother is dying. Her last wish is to see me settled." He stopped inches from her, the proximity sending a shiver down her spine. His scent, something crisp and clean with a hint of sandalwood, filled her senses. "I need a girlfriend." Jinxie's breath hitched. This was not happening. This had to be some bizarre, twisted joke. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. 50,000. She flinched, pulling away as if burned. "What? 50,000. To be my girlfriend. For appearances, of course. For grandma." Jinxie stared at him, her mind reeling. The offer, so brazen, so absurd, hung in the air between them. 50,000. It was a ludicrous sum, yet Mom's surgery. The crushing weight of medical bills. The desperation that had been a constant companion for months clawed at her, threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm not good at dealing with new products," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips, a stark contrast to the calculating glint in his eyes, "but I'm good at finding you a girlfriend. I'm here to interview for the online broadcaster role." Her voice trembled with a mix of indignation and a desperate, unwelcome sliver of temptation. "I'm aware," he responded, his voice smooth as silk. "But consider these a more personalized offer." He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This was wrong. This was insane. "But Mom, what choice do I have?" The desperate voice whispered in her ear. 50,000 when? The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face, so fleeting she almost missed it. "Upon agreement. And 20,001 per month thereafter." She swallowed, the lump in her throat thick and heavy. 20,001 per month is fine, too. Jinxie's initial refusal, fueled by righteous anger and a deep-seated sense of self-respect, had crumbled under the weight of her desperation. The image of her mother, pale and frail in the hospital bed, flashed before her eyes. This was not about her anymore. This was about survival. This was about saving the one person who mattered most. The contract, with all its unsettling implications, became a lifeline, a desperate bargain she couldn't refuse. The fluorescent lights of the room seemed to hum louder, a mocking soundtrack to the deal she was about to strike, a deal that would change everything. The insistent trill of his phone sliced through the sterile quiet of the underground parking garage. Gu Siqing grimaced, the fluorescent lights reflecting harshly off the sleek black surface of his car. He knew who it was. He'd known before he even glanced at the screen. Grandma. A sigh escaped him, a puff of condensation in the cool air. He'd been avoiding her calls all morning, the pressure a tight knot in his chest. He could almost hear her voice, sharp and laced with a strange mixture of affection and command. Marriage. Grandchildren. The words echoed in his mind, a constant refrain. He rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar throb of a tension headache beginning to build. Why couldn't she understand? Finding a wife wasn't like ordering takeout. It wasn't something that could be arranged and delivered with a click of a button. He finally answered, his voice strained, Grandma, Si Cheng. Where have you been? I've been calling all morning. Her voice, as expected, crackled with anxiety. Have you found a nice girl yet? Time is running out, you know. Gu Siqing gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold against his skin. Grandma, we've been over this. It's not that simple. Simple. What's not simple about finding a nice girl and settling down? All your cousins are married with children. Why are you so difficult? He closed his eyes, picturing the elaborate spreadsheets he'd created, the meticulous interview process he'd designed. He'd even offered a contract, for God's sake. I'm working on it, Grandma. I'm interviewing candidates. The word candidates felt cold and impersonal, even to his own ears. Interviewing? What are you, hiring a CEO? This is about love, Si Cheng. Connection. He could practically hear her waving her hand dismissively. I know, Grandma. I'll keep you updated. He disconnected the call before she could launch into another tirade, the silence in the garage a stark contrast to the ringing in his ears. He leaned back against the headrest, the cool leather a momentary comfort. If it weren't for Grandma, there's no need for this interview for best girlfriend and no need for these troubles. The thought echoed in his mind, tinged with bitterness. He started the engine, the low hum of vibration against his chest. He needed a distraction. He needed air. Meanwhile, across the city, the harsh glare of midday sun beat down on Hijinxi. She squinted, adjusting the angle of her phone, the screen reflecting in her tired eyes. The live stream was lagging, the connection flickering in and out. She forced a smile, her voice bright and cheerful despite the gnawing anxiety in her stomach. Hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. She'd been live streaming for hours, trying to boost her follower count, trying to scrape together enough money for her mother's surgery. Every donation, every click, was a step closer. She couldn't afford to fail. A sudden commotion at the intersection pulled her attention away from the screen. A car screeched, followed by a sickening thud. Hijinxi's heart lurched in her chest. She didn't hesitate. Hold on everyone, she muttered to her phone, already running towards the scene. A woman lay sprawled on the asphalt, a crumpled bicycle beside her. The driver, a young man with a panicked expression, was frantically dialing on his phone. Hijinxi knelt beside the woman, her hand hovering over the injured leg. Are you all right? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced back at her phone, still recording. I've recorded the entire process. I can't let you be bullied. Her followers were flooding the chat with concerned messages. She gave them a reassuring nod, her focus on the injured woman. Gu Siqing found himself drawn to the crowd gathering at the intersection. He slowed his car, curiosity piqued. A young woman was kneeling on the ground, her phone propped up against a nearby lamppost. She was speaking into the phone, her voice firm and clear, directing the bystanders to call an ambulance and assist the injured woman. He watched, a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify stirring within him. He recognized her. The influencer from the disastrous interview. The one who had stormed out, accusing him of being shallow and inconsiderate. Seeing her now, her brow furrowed with concern, her hands gently tending to the injured woman, a strange dissonance echoed in his mind. The image clashed with his preconceived notions. He had dismissed her as another attention-seeking internet personality, but here she was, her actions speaking louder than any carefully curated online persona. He watched as she helped the paramedics lift the injured woman onto a stretcher, her face etched with genuine concern. Later that day, the news of the accident, and Jinxie's quick thinking, spread across social media. Her follower count exploded, donations poured in. She sat beside her mother's hospital bed, the phone buzzing with notifications. Relief washed over her, a fragile wave against the constant undercurrent of worry. The surgery was within reach. She glanced at her mother's pale face, a pang of guilt twisting in her gut. She hadn't told her about the accident, about the live stream, about the desperate measures she'd taken to secure the funds. Her mother wouldn't approve. But what choice did she have? Gu Sicheng saw the news articles, the viral videos. He found himself replaying the image of Jinxie kneeling on the asphalt, her face illuminated by the harsh sunlight, her focus entirely on the injured woman. He thought about his grandmother's incessant demands, about the contract he'd offered, about the superficial criteria he'd used to judge the candidates. A wave of shame washed over him. He'd been so focused on fulfilling his grandmother's wishes, so preoccupied with finding a suitable girlfriend, that he'd completely missed the point. He'd overlooked the genuine kindness, the inherent goodness, that existed right in front of him. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Jinxie's contact information. He hesitated, a strange mix of apprehension and hope fluttering in his chest. He had a lot to explain. He had a lot to apologize for. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had a lot to learn. The rhythmic tapping of Gu Sicheng's pen against the polished mahogany desk was the only sound in his otherwise sterile office. Sunlight, fractured by the geometric patterns of the blinds, cast sharp lines across the room, accentuating the dust motes dancing in the air. Each tap was precise, measured, a tiny percussion against the growing unease churning within him. He stared at the resume in his hands, the crisp white paper now a crumpled mess from his restless fingers. Jinxie. Applicant number 6. Except, she wasn't. I looked through the interview materials and found out that she wasn't the applicant for number 6, his assistant stammered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Cheng's gaze snapped up, the intensity in his dark eyes making the young man flinch. A prickle of irritation, sharp and unwelcome, crawled under his skin. This disruption, this deviation from the expected, grated against his carefully ordered world. Explain. The word was clipped, devoid of any warmth. He could feel the familiar tightening in his chest, the precursor to the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. She's a famous local celebrity, the assistant blurted out, rushing to get the words out. Jinxie. A broadcaster. Quite popular online. He proffered a tablet, displaying a brightly colored profile page filled with pictures of a smiling woman. The same woman who had sat across from him, feigning nervousness, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The same woman who had agreed to his unconventional proposal. The air in the room seemed to thicken, suffocating him. He felt a strange mixture of anger and something else. A flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He snatched the tablet, his fingers brushing against the cool glass. The images on the screen swam before his eyes, a kaleidoscope of smiles and poses. This was a complication. A significant, unwelcome complication. His grandmother wouldn't approve. This wasn't part of the plan. The carefully constructed, meticulously organized plan to present a suitable girlfriend and appease the woman who held his life in her iron grip. He jinxie. A liar. A manipulator. Just like him. The thought struck him with unexpected force. He'd manipulated her, using his grandmother's illness as leverage, offering a contract that was more like a gilded cage. And she, in turn, had concealed her identity, weaving a web of deceit. He should be furious. He should terminate the contract, cut his losses, and start over. Yet he found himself scrolling through her profile, his gaze lingering on her photos. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a hint of sadness that belied the bright smiles. A knot formed in his stomach. Was it genuine? Or just another carefully crafted performance? He remembered her desperation, the way her hands trembled when she'd accepted his offer. Could it be that she was truly in need? Across the city, Jinxie's phone vibrated incessantly, a relentless buzzing against the worn fabric of her purse. Each vibration was a jolt of anxiety, a reminder of the weight pressing down on her. Debt collectors. Their voices, harsh and demanding, echoed in her mind, a constant soundtrack to her life. She glanced at her mother's pale face, the lines of worry etched deep into her skin. The hospital bills were piling up, a mountain of debt threatening to bury them both. Guilt twisted in her gut, a sharp, acidic pain. She'd lied to him, to Gu Si-cheng. She'd presented herself as someone she wasn't, a desperate attempt to secure the job, the money. Now, entangled in this web of lies, she felt trapped, suffocated. She closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe, to think. She had to find a way out, a way to protect her mother, to fix this mess. Jinx, what are we going to do? Her sister, Su Yangshi, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and frustration, broke through her thoughts. Yangshi, usually so carefree, so focused on her own pursuits, now looked at her with a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. Jinx reached out, her hand covering her sister's, the warmth a small comfort in the cold reality of their situation. "I'll figure something out," she whispered, the words more a promise to herself than to her sister. Yangshi, despite her initial selfishness, had surprised Jinx. She'd rallied, using her connections, her network of online friends and followers, to raise a small amount of money. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. It was a lifeline, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. "I talked to Fu Boya," Yangshi said hesitantly, her voice barely a whisper. He might be able to help. Jinx felt a chill run down her spine. Fu Boya. The charming, seemingly benevolent man who had offered her a helping hand, a way out of her financial struggles. His kindness had always felt too perfect, too calculated. She'd sensed a hidden agenda, a darkness lurking beneath the polished surface. "I don't know, Yangshi," she murmured, her brow furrowed. "I don't trust him." But what choice did she have? Back in his office, the silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic whir of the air conditioning. Gu Si-cheng stared at the tablet, the image of Jinxie's smiling face burned into his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to reconcile the woman he'd met, the desperate applicant with trembling hands, with the polished image of the online celebrity. He thought of his grandmother, her frail hand clutching his, her voice weak but filled with a fierce determination. "Find a good girl, Si-cheng. Settle down. Give me a great-grandchild before I..." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. He opened his eyes, the image of Jinxie's vulnerable expression flashing before him. He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He could end this now. He could walk away, find another suitable candidate, one who fit neatly into his carefully constructed plan. Yet, he hesitated. Something held him back, a strange, unfamiliar pull towards the chaos she represented. He tapped in her number, each digit a small act of defiance against the rigid order he had built around himself. The phone rang, each ring echoing the growing uncertainty in his heart. He was stepping into the unknown, into a world of complications and emotions he had always meticulously avoided. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to avoid it anymore. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that coated Jinxie's tongue. Her mother lay in the hospital bed, pale and fragile, tethered to beeping machines that pulsed with a rhythmic, unsettling life. Su Yangshi, Jinxie's sister, paced the small room like a caged tiger, her phone clutched tight in her hand. Jinxie knew that look, the desperate glint in Yangshi's eyes, the tight set of her jaw. It meant trouble, the kind that usually spilled over into Jinxie's life like a broken dam. He agreed, Yangshi finally announced, her voice brittle. But there are conditions. Jinxie's heart sank. She'd known this wouldn't be simple. A flicker of guilt pricked her conscience, a familiar pang. Her mother, her responsibility. The weight of it pressed down, heavy and suffocating. She had to find the money for the surgery, and fast. What conditions? Jinxie asked, her voice barely a whisper. She already knew, somehow, that the answer would taste of ash. Yangshi laid out the terms, each word a blow. A contract. A fake relationship. Gu Xicheng, the young CEO, needed a girlfriend to appease his ailing grandmother. Jinxie, desperate, was the perfect candidate. A wave of nausea rolled over Jinxie. This was madness. A charade, a performance, a lie built upon a foundation of desperation. But her mother. The image of her mother's frail hand, her whispered pleas for help, choked the protest in her throat. The opulent, almost suffocating, order of Gu Xicheng's apartment was a world away from the sterile chaos of the hospital. Jinxie felt out of place, like a stray brushstroke on a meticulously crafted canvas. Xicheng, with his unsettlingly precise movements and intense gaze, only amplified her discomfort. He handed her a thick, leather-bound notebook. "Everything you need to know," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. Jinxie flipped through the pages, a dizzying array of details about his life, his preferences, his habits. Down to the specific brand of mineral water he drank, the exact temperature he preferred his coffee, the way he folded his socks. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, a testament to the man's obsessive nature. "Memorize it," he commanded, his eyes, the color of dark chocolate, boring into hers. Every single detail. Jinxie's internal monologue was a cacophony of disbelief and resentment. This wasn't a relationship, it was a performance, a meticulously scripted play with no room for improvisation. She was being reduced to a prop, a carefully chosen accessory in his life, meant to fulfill a specific purpose. But the alternative, the thought of her mother suffering, was unbearable. "If you can't memorize these terms and give yourself away someday in front of grandma, then you and everything you want will disappear," Xicheng's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and cold as a winter wind. The underlying threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jinxie swallowed, the lump in her throat the size of a fist. That night, alone in the small, sterile guest room of his apartment, Jinxie stared at the notebook, the words blurring into a meaningless jumble. The absurdity of the situation pressed down on her, the weight of the lies, the pretense, the sheer manufactured nature of it all. She felt a surge of anger, a bitter resentment that coiled in her gut. He was buying her compliance, her silence, her very self. And she was selling. She thought of her online broadcasts, the small community she'd built, her dreams of making a living doing what she loved. All of it felt distant now, a faded photograph of a life she no longer recognized. This contract, this charade, was a cage, gilded perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. It confined her, restricted her, dictated her every move. She felt a wave of suffocating claustrophobia. But then, the image of her mother's face, etched with pain and worry, surfaced in her mind. The memory of her mother's whispered plea, "Jinxie, please," echoed in her ears. And the anger, the resentment, the claustrophobia, all of it receded, replaced by a dull ache of resignation. She had no choice. This was the price of her mother's health, her mother's life. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, Jinxie picked up the notebook again. She started to read, forcing herself to memorize the intricate details of Gu Si-cheng's life, each fact a bitter pill she swallowed, each word a link in the chain that bound her to this absurd, contrived relationship. The cool, impersonal words on the page became a script, a role she had to learn, a performance she had to perfect. The real Jinxie, with her dreams and aspirations, her hopes and fears, began to fade, replaced by the carefully constructed persona of Gu Si-cheng's girlfriend. A phantom, a ghost, a fabrication designed to appease a dying woman's wish. And somewhere, deep within the hollow shell of her former self, a tiny voice whispered, "What have I done?" The sterile scent of disinfectant, a constant in Gu Si-cheng's apartment, did little to calm the riot in Jinxie's stomach. Her suitcase, a battered thing that had seen better days, sat forlornly by the door, a stark reminder of her precarious situation. Si-cheng's apartment, a monument to minimalist design, felt like an alien landscape. Every surface gleamed, every object meticulously placed. She could practically feel the weight of his obsessive-compulsive disorder pressing down on her. "Don't touch anything. Don't mess anything up. Don't even breathe too loudly." Her internal monologue was a frantic scramble of anxieties. This wasn't a job, it was a performance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of lies. "You sleep on the sofa and I sleep on the bed," Si-cheng said, his voice as controlled and precise as his apartment. He didn't meet her eyes, his attention focused on aligning a stack of magazines on the coffee table with unnerving precision. Jinxie swallowed, the words catching in her throat. She had imagined this scenario 1,000 times, each version more awkward and uncomfortable than the last. The reality, however, was strangely antiseptic. "I'll keep my distance with you. You can treat me as your working partner." The words tumbled out, a desperate attempt to establish some semblance of normalcy, a fragile barrier against the undeniable intimacy of the arrangement. Working partner. That's it. Just a business transaction. She repeated the phrase internally, trying to convince herself. Si-cheng's fingers paused on the edge of a magazine, a slight twitch in his jaw the only sign that he'd registered her words. He finally looked up, his gaze cool and assessing. "As you wish." He turned away, the dismissal clear. "He probably thinks I'm some kind of gold digger." The thought stung, a prick of shame amidst the swirling anxiety. Later that day, meeting her friend, Xiao Wei, at a bustling cafe offered a brief respite from the suffocating order of Si-cheng's world. The aroma of coffee and the murmur of conversations were a welcome assault on her senses. Xiao Wei, ever the pragmatic one, pushed a small package across the table. "Just in case," she said, her eyes flickering nervously towards the entrance. Jinxie opened the package to reveal a small canister of pepper spray and a shrill personal alarm. A wave of unease washed over her. Just in case what? The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. She had downplayed the situation to Xiao Wei, painting it as an eccentric but harmless arrangement. Seeing the fear in her friend's eyes, a sliver of doubt began to worm its way into her carefully constructed facade of confidence. "It's nothing," she mumbled, tucking the items into her bag. Just precautions. That evening, an unexpected encounter with Fu Boya further complicated her already tangled emotions. He'd accidentally bumped into her outside a supermarket, his apologies profuse, his concern seemingly genuine. He insisted on helping her carry her groceries, his conversation a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. He spoke of her live streams, praising her talent and encouraging her to persevere. He's so kind. So understanding. The thought flitted through her mind, a fragile butterfly against the backdrop of her growing unease about Si Cheng. Returning to the apartment, the stark silence amplified her internal turmoil. Si Cheng was working in his study, the soft glow of the lamp painting long shadows across the hallway. She tiptoed inside, placing the groceries on the kitchen counter. The click of the refrigerator door echoed in the stillness. He emerged from the study, his expression unreadable. "You're back." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension. She busied herself unpacking the groceries, avoiding his gaze. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rustle of plastic bags. He cleared his throat. "About the contract," he began, his voice hesitant. He stopped, as if unsure how to continue. Jinxie held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Is he going to fire me? Does he regret this whole thing? A wave of panic washed over her. He finally continued, his words carefully chosen. "Perhaps we should discuss the specifics." His gaze finally met hers, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Jinxie's mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words, the subtle shift in his demeanor. Specifics? What specifics? The questions tumbled through her mind, a chaotic jumble of anxieties and hopes. Despite the manufactured nature of their relationship, a strange, unsettling awareness began to bloom between them, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile connection that was slowly, tentatively, forming amidst the web of lies and obligations. The pepper spray, nestled in her bag, felt like a cold, hard reminder of the precariousness of her situation, while the lingering warmth of Fu Boya's words offered a fleeting, illusory sense of comfort. Caught between the manufactured reality of her contract with Si Cheng and the unexpected kindness of Fu Boya, Jinxie felt adrift, navigating a treacherous emotional landscape with no clear direction in sight. The apartment, despite its pristine order, felt like a pressure cooker, the silence amplifying the unspoken questions and the growing sense of unease. The performance had begun, and Jinxie, caught in the spotlight, wasn't sure she knew her lines anymore. The saccharine scent of fake flowers hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that mirrored the artificiality of the entire situation. Jinxie tugged at the stiff, elaborately beaded bodice of the wedding dress, the weight of it a physical manifestation of the lie she was living. Across the bustling studio, Gu Si Cheng stood rigid in his tuxedo, his usual meticulous composure amplified to an almost painful degree. He adjusted his cufflinks, not once, not twice, but 3 times, the repetitive motion a familiar tic Jinxie was beginning to recognize as his way of managing discomfort. 3 times, she thought, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Just like he checks the locks on his door. This whole charade, this theatrical performance for his grandmother, was turning out to be far more bizarre than she could have ever imagined. "Miss, please tilt your head slightly to the left," the photographer chirped, his voice overly bright, overly enthusiastic. Jinxie complied, the forced smile on her face feeling as stiff as the glued-on eyelashes. Her internal monologue, however, was anything but compliant. "Tilt my head. Is this really my life? Faking a wedding photo shoot for a man I barely know, all for a handful of cash to pay for mom's surgery." The thought of her mother, frail and worried in the hospital bed, was a sharp pang of guilt in her chest. It was a powerful motivator, a constant reminder of the sacrifices she was willing to make. Gu Siqing, seemingly oblivious to her internal turmoil, remained a statue of formal unease. He kept glancing at his watch, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about his impatience. "She's taking too long," Jinxie imagined him thinking, "this whole thing is ridiculous. Germs, everywhere. So many germs." She could almost hear the whirring of his OCD-fueled anxieties, a silent soundtrack to this staged romance. Then came the suggestion that shattered the strained formality of the photo shoot. "Let's take Kung Fu for wedding photos," Jinxie blurted out, the words escaping before she could filter them. It was a desperate attempt to inject some humor, some semblance of her into this manufactured fairy tale. The photographer blinked, momentarily speechless. Gu Siqing's carefully constructed composure finally cracked, a flicker of surprise crossing his usually impassive features. "Kung Fu?" Jinxie could practically see the question mark hanging above his head. And yet, to her surprise, he agreed. What followed was a series of hilariously awkward poses, a blend of traditional wedding photography and poorly executed martial arts moves. Jinxie, despite the absurdity of it all, found herself genuinely laughing. The tight knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a strange, unexpected lightness. Even Gu Siqing, though clearly out of his element, couldn't suppress the occasional twitch of his lips. He was a man who rarely smiled, she'd observed, and each fleeting upturn of his mouth felt like a small victory. Later, at Gu Siqing's impeccably clean and unervingly organized home, his grandmother beamed at the photos, her wrinkled face radiating pure joy. "Seeing you two love each other so much," she declared, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm relieved. I can finally rest easy." Her words were a warm blanket, a balm to Jinxie's guilt. She believes it, Jinxie thought, a complex mix of relief and unease swirling within her. She actually believes we're in love. The weight of that belief, of the responsibility it entailed, settled heavily on Jinxie's shoulders. The charade was no longer just a means to an end, it was a performance for an audience of one, a performance fueled by a genuine desire to bring happiness to an elderly woman nearing the end of her life. Gu Siqing, too, seemed affected by his grandmother's happiness. The rigid lines of his posture softened, the tension around his eyes eased. He looked at Jinxie, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Gratitude? Perhaps. Or maybe something more. The complexity of their situation was further amplified by the intrusion of the outside world. Business calls, contract negotiations, the shadowy figure of Fu Boya lurking in the periphery, offering help that felt suspiciously convenient, all of it served as a stark reminder that their carefully constructed bubble of pretend domesticity was fragile, easily shattered by the harsh realities of their lives. Jinxie learned of a lucrative business opportunity, one that could solve her financial problems without the need for this elaborate charade. But the opportunity came with strings attached, strings that threatened to entangle her in a web of deceit even more complicated than the one she was already in. Gu Siqing, meanwhile, was grappling with his own set of challenges. The pressure from his grandmother to marry, the complexities of running his company, the unexpected disruption of Jinxie's presence in his meticulously ordered life, all of it was pushing him to the edge of his carefully controlled existence. He found himself questioning his motivations, the lines between what he should feel and what he actually felt becoming increasingly blurred. The contract, the carefully worded agreement that defined their relationship, was starting to feel less like a safety net and more like a cage. As the day drew to a close, Jinxie stood at her apartment window, the city lights twinkling like a scattered handful of diamonds against the velvet backdrop of the night sky. The wedding photos, still in their ornate studio folder, lay on her table, a tangible reminder of the lie that was slowly morphing into something else. Something she couldn't quite define. The image of Gu Siqing, his usually stoic face softened by a rare smile, flashed through her mind. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unexpected warmth that bloomed in her chest. "It's just a contract," she told herself firmly. "Just a contract." But even as she repeated the words, a nagging doubt lingered, a whisper of possibility that refused to be silenced. The contract was a lie, yes, but what if, just what if, a lie could blossom into something real? The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the hospital air, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within Jinxie. Her mother's surgery had been successful, a weight lifted from her shoulders, yet the tangled web she'd woven with Gu Xicheng and the looming shadow of Fu Boya's offer pressed down on her. She glanced at Su Yangshi, her sister, a flicker of guilt mixing with relief. Su Yangshi, in a rare display of responsibility, was quietly arranging the flowers sent by. Well, she wasn't entirely sure. The card simply read, "Get well soon." Jinxie suspected it was from Gu Xicheng. The thought brought a strange warmth, quickly chased away by the image of Fu Boya's smooth, apologetic smile. He'd promised to visit, to explain everything. A part of her dreaded it, another, fueled by desperation, clung to the hope he offered. He arrived precisely when he said he would, a bouquet of lilies in hand, their perfume battling with the hospital's antiseptic. He cut a striking figure against the pale walls, radiating an almost theatrical sincerity. "Miss He," he began, his voice soft and contrite, "I've come to formally apologize." He extended the lilies, a gesture Jinxie hesitated to accept. Her internal monologue was a whirlwind. Was this genuine remorse or another calculated move? She took the flowers, their cool stems a stark contrast to the heat rising in her cheeks. "Mr. Fu, please," he interrupted, his smile gentle, "call me Boya." He held her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I understand my actions caused you considerable distress. The truth is," he paused, drawing a breath, "I was deeply impressed by your online presence, your charisma. I saw potential, a raw talent that needed nurturing." Jinxie's skepticism warred with a desperate hope. This could be her chance, her escape from the precarious tightrope she'd been walking. "And the interview?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A misunderstanding," he admitted, his expression a careful blend of regret and admiration. He gestured towards the chairs lining the hallway. "May we sit?" Jinxie nodded, her mind racing. As they settled, Boya continued, his voice gaining a subtle edge of business. "I hope you can consider signing with me, promoting our new line of skincare products online. Your unique style, your connection with your audience, it's exactly what we're looking for." The weight of the offer settled upon her, heavy and complex. It felt too easy. Too convenient. The nagging suspicion that this was all somehow connected to Gu Xicheng resurfaced. The memory of his sharp gaze, his strange mix of arrogance and vulnerability, flickered in her mind. She needed time, space to untangle this web of coincidences. "Too neat to think about it," she managed, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Later that day, back in the familiar confines of Gu Xicheng's office, the silence felt thick with unspoken words. He sat behind his imposing desk, his usual meticulous order disrupted by a scattering of papers. His gaze was fixed on her, a mixture of intensity and was that apprehension. Jinxie shifted uneasily, the echoes of Boya's offer resonating in her ears. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the strained quiet. Jinxie," he began, his voice a low rumble, "to owe you an explanation." He paused, as if wrestling with his words. Jinxie simply waited, her own thoughts a tangled mess. She'd come prepared to sever their strange, contractual agreement, to accept the lifeline Fu Boya had thrown her. Yet, standing before Gu Xicheng, seeing the subtle vulnerability beneath his carefully constructed facade, she hesitated. My grandmother, he began again, his voice laced with a weary resignation, she's persistent. A flicker of a wry smile touched his lips. And 2M not very good at disappointing her. Jinxie's own lips curved in response. This was a side of Gu Sicheng she hadn't seen before, a glimpse beneath the mask of control. He stood, rounding the desk, his movements less rigid than usual. The truth is, he continued, stopping before her, his gaze searching hers, "Tu didn't expect," he trailed off, his cheeks flushing a faint pink. Jinxie held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I didn't expect to enjoy your company," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The confession hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Jinxie stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't the cold, calculating CEO she'd initially met. This was a man grappling with unfamiliar emotions, a man who, beneath the layers of OCD and familial pressure, was vulnerable. "The contract," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He raised a hand, silencing her. "Forget the contract," he said, his gaze unwavering. "What I'm offering, no, it's different." He paused again, searching for the right words. "I'm asking you," he Jinxie, "not as a contractual obligation, but as myself." He took a deep breath, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Would you have dinner with me? A real date?" The question hung in the air, charged with unspoken possibilities. Jinxie's mind raced. Fu Boya's offer, with its promise of stability, security, a future, it all seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the raw, unexpected emotion radiating from Gu Sicheng. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the demanding CEO, the man with the obsessive quirks, but a man struggling to express his feelings, a man she, surprisingly, found herself drawn to. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile, fueled not by desperation or obligation, but by a flicker of something more. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "I would like that very much." A sigh of relief escaped Gu Sicheng's lips, his shoulders relaxing as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He smiled back, a genuine smile that transformed his face, erasing the usual tension and revealing a warmth she'd never seen before. In that moment, amidst the lingering scent of antiseptic and the echoes of unspoken words, something shifted, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of lies and miscommunication, blooming into the promise of something real.